Whoa, me speaking positively about something Xenoblade 2 related? There's no way. According to the internet, I'm just some clout-chasing shill who looks to hate everything about the series that isn't Xenoblade 1 because elitism or performativeness or something. Xenoblade Chronicles 2, Torna the Golden Country. Man, that's a really long title. I think I'm just gonna call it Torna for brevity's sake, is a standalone expansion to the aforementioned title that initially started as a DLC story bundled in the expansion pass for Xenoblade 2. At some point, it must have blossomed into a full-fledged title for Monolith Soft since it was unveiled at E3 2018 as its own entry in the Xenoblade series, being advertised as such with a physical release and progression and gameplay system that was completely separate from its predecessor. Torna's weird half-step status as a release definitely served to confuse a lot of people, including myself. It's a prequel tale tied directly to the events of Xenoblade 2, but it was advertised as its own experience exclusive from that game, but it also shared a world and assets and characters with Xenoblade 2. It's funny because a lot of people nowadays will probably tell you to play Torna before playing Xenoblade 2 in order to get a lot of the context that Xenoblade 2 felt it was missing at launch, but I digress. So yeah, Torna the Golden Country. This video was a long time coming. Despite Torna being a prequel tale tied to Xenoblade 2 by name and world, it surprisingly makes a lot of quality of life changes and departures from the foundation of that game. The result is a game that offers a refreshing and unique experience that separates itself from its predecessor in nearly every way. There's a lot to unpack here, so we'll get into it as quickly as possible. But before I do, I want to advise that if Xenoblade 2 left a bad taste in your mouth and you haven't played Torna as a result, give it a shot, it might honestly surprise you. It's key to note that Torna was already being worked on during the initial release of Xenoblade 2 and released about a year after it. Normally, I decry the basic premise of a prequel being released this closely after the main story because what typically follows is retconning, providing context, and essentially making sense of what the base story couldn't, which in all honesty kinda devalues the standalone work that came before. I suppose the relationship between Xenoblade 2 and Torna is so strange that it makes sense as to why they decided to tell the story in Memento Mori by giving us the prequel last, but I also wouldn't be surprised if Torna was supposed to be part of vanilla Xenoblade 2 at launch, but instead developed into its own game entirely. It's odd how I always turn to Star Wars as a comparison, but the relationship between Torna and Xenoblade 2 honestly mirrors the one that those films had with their main stories and prequels. Both of the initial stories revolve around a standalone narrative that exists within the context of a larger world, and the prequels provide that context later on for better or for worse. The main difference here is that the prequel for Xenoblade 2 is actually good. So just flip it for Star Wars, like imagine if episodes 4 through 6 were the bad ones, and 1 through 3 were really good. And that's somehow where my opinion lands on Torna. In a way, I can kinda understand why they didn't give us Torna first, because a lot of what Xenoblade 2's story hinges on is the surprises and twists it makes. Things like Jin being a flesh eater, or Malos being an Aegis, Pyra and Mithra being the same person, or a Malthus just being evil. Without those plot cards, some of the heavier moments in Xenoblade 2 just don't land. But it also doesn't excuse the fact that most of my time playing Torna, I was rubbing my temples in frustration or screaming to myself about how Jin's motivations made a hell of a lot more sense after seeing his relationship with Laura develop, or how Amalthus is actually set up properly as a villain in this tale, or even how Mikhail was actually given a backstory and turns from a trope-filled stock character into an actual dynamic character with gradual progression in Torna. Despite my utter frustration with Xenoblade 2 and Torna as a package, I'm primarily judging Torna as a standalone experience separate from the extended lore and world that it provides context to. Make no mistake, that doesn't mean I won't be making constant comparisons to this in Xenoblade 2. They are part of the same package after all. I just hope to separate and leave behind the grievances I've held with Xenoblade 2 and start fresh with this title. So with that said, what are my overall thoughts on Torna? Well, I like it. There are so many notable changes and improvements it makes over Xenoblade 2, from its combat to its storytelling and writing. This is a step in a direction that I appreciated because it felt more tight-knit, like there was more care put into its finer details and its much smaller scale, versus the more grandiose and far-reaching ambitions of Xenoblade 2. Between Xenoblade 2's expansive cast, the huge world of numerous titans and warring factions, and the numerous villains and subplots, that game honestly felt like it stretched itself too thin, which is another complaint I had in retrospect. Xenoblade 2 was always jumping around between villains, plot points, and locales that nothing really had time to marinate. But Torna is definitely more focused and intimate. It's all about our small cast, their fight against Malos, and exploration of the Tornan Titan. So what is Torna, the Golden Country? Well, for those who are out of the loop, Torna is a prequel story to Xenoblade 2 that follows Jin, a deuteragonist and one of the primary antagonists of Xenoblade 2, and his driver Laura as they travel with the Aegis, Mithra, and her driver Adam in an attempt to stop the destruction strewn about Alrest by Malos, the other Aegis. What ensues is an origin story for all of the main actors involved, one that sets up each of our characters' motivations for Xenoblade 2, while also developing them in a myriad of ways that expands their characterization beyond the basic plot threads they were provided in Xenoblade 2. Torna is less of an epic tale of Gundams and gods, and is more of an interpersonal story between characters that desperately needed more development. It's a slow burner without much in terms of large-scale action, with a focus instead on some of the more minute details of its world and characters, which is a refreshing change of pace from Xenoblade 2's more wacky and over-the-top delivery. One of the most unique aspects of Torna revolves around how it handles its protagonists. Torna sets itself up to be that grand tale of destiny that follows Adam and Mithra just by its premise, but it instead leans on focusing on the goals of a small-town girl named Laura, whose dreams of being a Tornan driver and search for her mother give us a nice contrast in perspective and scale. Her connection and relationships to her blades, Jin and Haze, are really felt in her character, and it creates a solid feeling of intimacy with the protagonist that really wasn't felt in Xenoblade 2. Here we have a story that's primed to be this gargantuan world-saving tale, but it instead focuses on our characters' dwarfing personal struggles and identities. It's charming, and I appreciate when a narrative can still manage to make a giant, wacky fantasy story relatable.
At first I thought to take it, but I'd made it for her, and I'd like her to keep it forever.
What I personally love about Laura's tale is that it's set up with these expectations of following JRPG tropes, but it turns into a tale of tragedy. She starts as an orphan nobody with a heart of gold who's a fated driver of two of the most powerful blades in existence. She even gets knighted and follows a fated hero's journey, but instead of fulfilling her destiny, she faces an untimely end, with her legacy only leaving behind heartbreak and bloodshed, with her closest friend turning into a future villain and antagonist. I love when a story manages to throw you for a loop like this. The narrative structure in Torna is easily the most unorthodox Xenoblade plot in terms of its main actors and cast. It's refreshing, and I can appreciate that, especially since it's fairly straightforward and simple in its delivery. Of course, it would have been much more impactful if we didn't already know how the story ends because we had received Xenoblade 2 first, but I appreciate the structure of this tale regardless. While we're on the subject of Laura and Jin, I guess I should mention their relationship, as it is one of the things that left me with unease by the end of the game. Again, I use the term grooming to kind of describe Rex and Pyra's relationship in Xenoblade 2, but if there's any key example of actual grooming in a story, it's Jin and Laura's relationship. I'm only going to touch briefly on this, but it does creep me out that Laura bonded with Jin when she was only a child, and their relationship developed from a protector and brother and sister sort of dynamic to this weird romance at certain points. The relationship developing into a romance is only ever really explored in one cutscene midway through Torna, but it was a strange pivot in their already established relationship, with Jin as Laura's guardian.
Laura, you okay? What happened?
You got me right here. My heart's pounding!
But...
That was such an awesome line!
What?
Jin, you didn't even realize, did you? Sometimes you'll say something and I'll just swoon.
But...
I don't think any girl could refuse you.
It just didn't jive with me, and it felt a little half-assed in terms of establishing a romance between two characters, and it also felt tactless and kinda gross with their obvious age gap. The way that Torna is written is the biggest step up compared to Xenoblade 2 for me. What I appreciate here is that nearly everything that is relevant to our main characters in this story, and that is also relevant in setting up the story in Xenoblade 2, plays out right in front of us.
Flesh eaters.
There's very little needless fluff, and many of the story beats and moments are essential and are set up to create some sort of impact for a reason. Whether it ties directly to Torna itself or the events that transpire in Xenoblade 2, Torna nearly perfectly puts the pieces together of the overall fragmented tale of the Xenoblade 2 world. It is much more concise and compact than its predecessor. We get to see the tragic events unfold that led to Mithra sealing away her powers and creating Pyra. We actually get to see the Aegis as Aeons, and they become established in their force and power early on. We get to see the exact thing that leads Jin to creating Torna and the destruction created by an army led by Amalthus. Jin is also like the best character in this expansion, so I'm going to talk about him ad nauseum, don't worry. And biggest of all, you actually get to see Amalthus slowly progress into a self-righteous vigilante and antagonist. Yeah, Amalthus, you know, the guy who was ham-fisted in as the true villain of Xenoblade 2 at the 2/3 mark of the game. His connection to Malos and dissenting hatred of humanity is actually explored here, and we get concrete examples of his sinister behavior behind the scenes, and his presence as a villain and manipulator is active throughout the plot instead of just being delegated to flashbacks.
Everybody knows a blade's appearance bears no relation to their power. You could be the heroine of our resistance.
No, I won't be anyone's anything.
That's fine now. I have only one thing to ask of you. To rectify the mistake I made and erase Malos from the face of the world.
Plus, Torna seriously drops most of the shit that I hated about how Xenoblade 2 told its story. It's very rare that we see our characters sit back and spout needless exposition that just explains the things that we already see in front of us. Instead, they just spend time doing things that build upon their characters, whilst their dialogue exists to create their personality and sets the tone for a scene. There's one key example of how Torna's writing is just leagues better than Xenoblade 2's, and it's very subtle, but that's what I love about it, honestly. So one of Xenoblade 2's biggest themes focused on outlining the special bond that blades and drivers had with each other in the world of Allrest. Ignoring how the game's gacha system was almost completely antithetical to this theme and messaging, the game constantly beat the player over the head with the importance of this idea. In Torna, there's one scene I recall that does a better job than the entirety of Xenoblade 2 in showcasing this theme. So early on, Jin and Laura get into a tense fight with Mithra and her current driver Adam, the original driver of the Aegis. Despite being severely underpowered compared to Mithra and Adam, Jin and Laura still manage to hold their own in a fight with them by synergizing as a team, and manage to even impress Adam himself as a result.
You!
What?
Incredible! You! Both of you!
Huh?
That last attack, the force behind it was absurd. I'm amazed.
Oh, really? Well, that's just...
Oh, and passing the weapon. What a concept. How did you ever come up with that idea?
Oh, well... We were broke.
Huh?
We couldn't afford meals, let alone another sword. And so we made do.
You're kidding. Oh man, you guys are the best. I haven't laughed this hard in ages.
Huh?
I really, really like you two.
Adam's love for their use of passing their weapon, a tactic he assumed they employed because of their battle expertise, actually being a natural result of them just not having enough money for a second weapon, perfectly displays that theme by establishing a special connection between Laura and Jin without outright saying they have it. They decide to pass the weapon so they can work together as a unit. Not only that, but their acceptance and foregoing having a weapon for both of them shows their trust in each other. What I love about this scene is that they just leave it at that too. There's no further elaboration on this tactic aside from Adam just pointing out that he liked it, which is a natural reaction. They let the fight choreography help develop our characters and relationships, something that even my favorite game never really did, so kudos for that. What makes this scene a personal favorite of mine too is something that happens much later in the story. When everyone's fighting Malus at the Tornan capital, Malus goes on an evil rant about how humans are bad, and immediately after, Adam does the same exact tactic.
Father is generous. He pays no attention to things like that.
You're wrong. You don't understand the consequences.
Don't I?
And you don't understand what humans are.
Malos, the all-knowing.
A diligent student, you could say.
Then learn this.
Huh?
Mithra!
Heads up!
Ah! Yeah! Yeah! Ah!
He replicates what he learned from Jin and Laura when they first met and passes Mithra's weapon between him and her. This scene once again doesn't further elaborate on the context behind their actions. Adam doesn't look at Laura and say, "We learned a lot from you guys." He just does it and lets the pieces fall into place for those who paid attention. Plus, it's another fantastic moment where we see character progression and development through fight choreography. Another great example of characterization in Torna actually exists in gameplay too. When your cast sets up camp somewhere, you're able to use some of their signature traits in order to obtain certain items from materials you gather. For example, Jin can cook really well, so he makes cuisine. Laura can craft charms, Hayes can make talismans, and Mithra can cook horrible abominations of food. It's a nice little bit of charm and personality added to our characters through a fairly simple gameplay mechanic. Also, I just want to add here that one of the things I love about this game is how much the entire cast just shits all over Mithra whenever she acts out or says something unnecessarily rude or bitchy to someone. There's no shortage of the cast members calling her out for her BS, and I'm all here for it because personality-wise, I just don't like Mithra. I was originally going to do a Mithra getting owned counter, but it seemed like too much work and didn't really fit with the flow of the video, so here's just the highlight reel of her getting shut down by everyone.
Oh, come on, Milton. I've been with him the whole time. You really think these two would cause any harm?
You've been using your dumb artifice again, haven't you?
Dumb?
So yeah, sure, nothing to worry about, right?
Milton? Who's this then?
Fat load of good that'll do, in the long run. The world keeps turning anyway.
You might think that. But mercenaries and statesmen each have their own views and ways to effect change. It's not in vain.
A blade siding with humans. You don't see that every day.
I think it's blades like you that are rare.
Well, duh. You do know what I am, right?
Lacking in compassion.
Huh?
Blades like you really are a rare sight. That may be for the best.
How dare he speak to me like that? He thinks he knows me.
Course is the word.
Yeah, he is.
I meant you.
Me? You think this is bad? Just stick around for a bit.
Nobody's, like, making you come along, you know.
Well, unfortunately, a driver and blade are one in body and soul.
As if you don't do whatever you feel like anyway.
Keep going like that, you'll get a reputation.
Cheap, you say? Don't be absurd. It's called tactics, look it up. But perhaps that's something a simpleton like yourself could never hope to comprehend!
A simpleton? I have no particular interest in this world or its future.
And Malus himself?
His thoughts, I'm especially uninterested in. We've never even met.
Please, don't mistake her. Despite the attitude, she's a good kid.
The hell is with that tone? Where do you get off acting all parental?
I enjoy that no one else in this game likes Mithra.
Mithra! Stop! We've got children here!
The story focuses on a tighter-knit group of ragtag misfits. You have the fated legendary wielder of the Aegis, who isn't the main character this time around, a major change of pace, an orphan girl who had the hands of fate forced upon her, and a noble emperor who almost acts like a commoner. Each character in Torna plays a role in the plot, and no one really feels shafted. I mentioned it briefly before, but Jin is the best character here by a mile. We almost see an inverse of most of the protagonist development in Jin. When we're first exposed to him here, despite his cold and stoic behavior, he's shown to be rather compassionate toward others and is very protective of those around him, especially Laura in particular.
I'm afraid I don't particularly like fighting.
And to think we're hearing that from the strongest man in Torna.
Hell, he's even giving Mithra lectures on being more affectionate and understanding toward humankind. But as the story progresses and events unfold, we start to see Jin's ruthless side come out. Like when he attacks Gort and threatens to essentially cut him into pieces and tear him limb from limb.
Had enough. What's next then? Right leg? Or the left? Or how about...
Enough! That's enough, Jin. Just leave him. For my sake.
Oh yeah, I guess I'll briefly talk about Gort since he's the game's shock factor villain in many ways. He's kind of the type of villain that you'll love to hate, and in many ways he's almost identical to Metalface from Xenoblade 1. He just really lacks that impact and punch, with him just being some random asshole who assaults our party and who tried to hurt Laura as a child. I think I'd definitely like him more if he had a larger presence in the title aside from his appearance in Torgoth and his surprise freakish monster transformation at the end, which, can we talk about that for a sec?
Caught up with you at last, Laura.
How do you know my name?
It knows human speech.
But it's not a blade.
Because that was such a weird, out of left field thing, and a complete change of pace from the other parts of the story. It almost felt like Xenoblade was turning into some shock horror game for a second. Monolith definitely had skipped a few hundred steps in the plot and really needed to piece that end bit together better. I know what happens. It's easy to follow that Amalthus's crazy scientist dude turns him into some freakish Blade Eater experiment, but it just felt really abrupt to have a boss fight with him in the post-credits scene when he was absent from the game for pretty much the entire adventure. Back on Jin, his character definitely takes a darker turn by the end of the game, and I love that. I love that we see the gentle giant turn into an anti-hero. It's such a unique spin on the trope laid out in storytelling. I could say a similar thing about Adam too. He's jovial and awkward in a charming way, but he shows his moments of vulnerability beneath his confident facade. It's obvious that he puts on a face of being able to handle anything in order to make those around him feel more secure.
When we first met, we could have burnt you to pieces. Though fortunately, we avoided that thanks to Jin.
Is that why you were away from the militia?
As I am not in full control of Mithra's power. Scores of soldiers could die by my hand. I was frightened. This cataclysm Malos caused, it's likely all because Questa Amalthus was unable to control him. And if that's true, then perhaps I too.
But he ultimately throws in the towel and hides away his shame when he fails to stop Malos and Mithra from destroying all of Torna. Adam ending his journey with a whimper like that is such a different way to tell a fated hero's tale, and I love it. It flips the script on its head, and I'm all here for it. Even characters like Minoth, Bridget, and Hugo all have tragic endings at the end of Torna, and it makes me appreciate the world of Allrest a lot more. In stark contrast to Xenoblade 2, where a bunch of goofy, nonsensical, lighthearted shit happens that completely breaks any sort of immersion with the more serious moments of the characters and plot, Torna opts to take itself a lot more seriously in what is arguably the darkest Xenoblade title to date. I mean, this is the first Xenoblade game without a main Nopon character, and in the world of Xenoblade 2, that means no more memes. Monolith Soft knew they were making a more serious entry, and I vibe hard with it. Torna features the best combat in the series. This combat system perfectly represents the messaging and theming of the world and lore. The narrative to gameplay cohesion here is chef's kiss levels of amazing, and leagues better than the gacha thing that Xenoblade 2 tried to do, which, in my opinion, as a premise, was completely antithetical to the entire message that Xenoblade 2 tried to convey, with its overall emphasis on drivers and blades working together and having some sort of symbiotic relationship. That entire message is kinda undermined when you're chucking out common blades that are useless to you and fishing for cosmos. In Torna, the main squad is all you have, but what comes with that is a myriad of other tools and mechanics to play around with. The key inclusion here is the ability to swap between playing as the blade or the driver, while the supporting members offers buffs to the pair's active fighter. You also have the ability to switch between one of the two blades linked to any of the cast on the fly as well. This allows you to really play around with a number of tools and characters that seem small at first, but really expands and feels meaningful as you progress. The same core system of the Xenoblade series and Xenoblade 2 respectively is still here, but each character is designed to complement the rest of our cast, and with the added ability to switch between blades and driver on the fly, you're given such added agency that you'll spend less time in combat worrying about what the AI is doing and spending more time determining what your next step should be from the myriad of tools you're given. In Torna, you have 4 types of arts that are used in combat. Vanguard arts are the 3 basic arts at the bottom right that you use when fighting enemies and are equivalent to driver arts in Xenoblade 2. Rearguard arts are passive buffs that the supporting non-active character will use throughout the fight and are equivalent to blade arts. Talent arts are gamble arts for the characters. They'll take something away from you, but in return you'll get some sort of buff. Finally, you have switch arts, which are the arts that will induce a status like break, topple, or smash upon switching between a character. Torna having a really tighter and more focused combat system largely lies in its character synergy. For example, Laura and Jin are almost a glass cannon pair. Laura has an ability that can cause break in an enemy, her switch art allows her to topple, and once you have the enemy toppled, Jin can capitalize with arts that deal more damage in certain positions, and then you switch back to Laura with a switch art that will launch the enemy. Laura's talent art will also cut her HP in half and fill all of her Vanguard arts, but she's paired with Haze, the healer of the cast, to offset that negative effect. This synergy extends to other characters too, but I love how deliberately they design the characters to work with one another because it really does make the gameplay system feel a lot more reflective of the narrative and overlying plot themes. Switching between characters not only provides a number of interesting character and ability combinations to keep you on your toes, but it also looks a lot less goofy than having the Aegis, a legendary blade with the power to level entire countries, just sit there in gameplay 90% of the time. So yeah, Torna's combat system perfectly encapsulates the world of the game and almost completely removes that ludonarrative dissonance that exists in the previous entry. The gameplay itself finally looks and feels as epic as the fights in the cutscenes. So I've sung this game's praises so far, and there's a lot here for someone to actually like, which is great. But I have one major criticism of Torna, and if you played it, you'll likely know where I'm coming from here. But there is one key mechanic and aspect of this game that really holds it back for me and makes my experience for playing it feel like a slog. Yes, I'm talking about the Torna community feature. The global affinity chart from Xenoblade 1 and X is sort of back in the form of the community feature, but it's watered down and a significant downgrade from the past systems that existed before it. The old affinity chart system showed you how characters in the world were connected and was a tool for discovering trade items and locations that help you locate NPCs who would move following certain story events. This system purely exists to track a mandatory requirement for story progression and nothing more. With the community feature, you can talk to an NPC, and once you do, they'll either join your affinity chart or will give you a quest to complete in order for them to become a supporter of yours. You need to pretty much complete 64 side quests for characters to reach the community level required to get the ending of the game. What hurts this feature is how it stops the progression of the plot and pads out the game to unbelievable degrees with pure monotony and grinding, and it does it on both the micro and macro level. Not only are you required to perform side quests for 64 different NPCs in order to reach the community level 4 and just beat the game, but the only way to access a majority of these side quests in the first place is to go around and talk to quite literally every NPC that you see. Talking to NPCs adds them to the community chart. Every time you talk to a new NPC, the game is paused, the community menu is pulled up, and the character's icon is added to the chart. Every time you perform a side quest for NPCs, the game is paused, and the character's icon is added to the supporters circle. It adds so much time just watching that slow-ass screen load in and pop up. Plus, it completely deflates gameplay and halts any sort of momentum and progress you may have felt. You're pretty much going to reach a story moment, get hard stopped by your community level, and will have to grind for side quests for like 10 plus hours just to get to the ending. Imagine just running around doing fetch quests for a character in Torna, spending an hour looking for a rare material, only to just return to the character and have that slow-ass animation play out. Or imagine that you just somehow forgot to talk to a handful of characters in Gormott, so you're just missing random quests that you need in order to raise your community level. It backloads a lot of the most boring aspects of the game into the last leg of it, and I was not a fan of doing dozens of fetch quests and running back and forth between continents and areas. It got real old real quick. Forcing the player to build the community level would be like forcing someone to rebuild Colony 6 to max in order to see the ending in Xenoblade 1. It baffled me that they did it, because otherwise Torna did still feel like a substantive enough experience to not have to do that. Perhaps Monolith Soft weren't confident that just the base game was enough to justify the asking price and status of a standalone experience, or maybe they're just sadists, I don't know. What I do know is that I hope they don't ever do this again in a future title. It really did kill the pace for an otherwise enjoyable experience for me. And it was that last leg of the community feature that blew a lot of steam out of the title for me, having the story just halt for about 10 hours at the end, only to be immediately thrust into the big climactic final fight, felt like whiplash, and also seemed draining. The gradual pacing that existed before the community feature was just destroyed with the implementation of it, and it truly baffles me that they didn't try to pace out the side quests between the story bits a bit more seamlessly. I wanted to end this review off talking about some of the finer story details of Torna, with some aspects of the plot that jumped out to me and some that I may have had gripes with. I figured that I'd save the most nitpicking aspects for the end, since that's what most people seem to have issues with in my reviews. One of the things that Azurta talks to our cast about within the Tornan womb is how blades eventually become titans and gain autonomy when this process happens, eventually allowing them to look over the humans that they once lived with.
After all, I was a blade born from the Tornan Titan. Of course, I don't have any memories of that time. Once a blade becomes a Titan, they can live without being bound to the driver who awoke them. One day, they may come to watch over their children as the very ground beneath their feet.
And the fleeting bonds become eternal. It's the basis of the Tornan Creed.
What honestly bugs me about this is that Jin is right in the room with him as he explains this, but still ends up following through on his plan with Xenoblade 2's to destroy humankind because they enslave blades. I get that it's about the journey and not the destination when it comes to the exploitation of blades, but when they eventually just become titans, his entire blades become subject to human whims motivation feels a little moot. I actually really enjoy Malos as a villainous force in Torna, versus in Xenoblade 2. He is the sole-focused antagonist, and his presence can be felt in nearly every story moment. He especially has a lot more time to shine in his dialogue and delivery.
Really? Then... that's what I will be called too. After all, I am born of divinity, not just some reflection.
He just oozes of this asshole who I want to stop vibe here, and considering how often Xenoblade 2 jumped between primary antagonists, and how frequently they changed the focus and goal of our cast, it's refreshing to have a singular, massively threatening villain in Torna, and I hope that future titles follow suit in it. I also like how Jin from the past leaves a note behind in a journal instructing him on how to become a flesh eater. It's a nice subtle touch that helps build the narrative. Aside from that, the ending battle between Mithra and Malos is pretty epic, I guess, and I love how Hugo's sacrifice shows a moment of vulnerability for our cast. When the dust had settled and he died, they didn't really say anything to each other and the story just kind of played out. Also, I appreciate that they played the instrumental version of Drifting Soul here. It honestly made it much more tolerable. But yeah, in all honesty, I really like Torna. As a separate package from Xenoblade 2, it harbors a lot to appreciate in its delivery and its standalone narrative. The character interactions are tight, the story has a focus and a much more consistent tone, and despite the slog that is the community feature, it manages to have its standout moments still feel memorable and strong. I like Torna by itself, but in all honesty, Torna being kinda good made me dislike Xenoblade 2 even more when I replayed it last year. I know this isn't what the internet wants to hear and all, but I figured I'd just throw in this bit at the tail end because I do feel it's important to clarify why I like Xenoblade 2's prequel, but I disliked the actual game. Torna fills in a lot of the plot gaps and introduces us to a lot of plot points, ideas, and themes that just felt hastily rushed into Xenoblade 2. The knowledge of Jin's relationship to Laura, Malos, Hayes, and Mithra that Torna provides would have made me care for his plight and character a lot more if it was in the base game. Things like Amalthus' status as a villain would have felt much more natural had I played Torna first. Even beyond the plot filling that Torna provides, it just feels so jarring going from the ultra-serious Torna to the goofy and easygoing Xenoblade 2. It almost feels like a bait and switch, and honestly makes me wish that Xenoblade 2 was more tonally consistent overall, so it better fit with what Torna had started. Now, would I recommend that you play Torna first? Honestly, yes. It would make a lot more of the confusing or strange moments in Xenoblade 2 feel more palatable and easier to digest. In fact, Torna is a great jumping off point for the series as a whole, and I honestly suggest that if you're interested in Xenoblade and don't know where to start, Torna might be the right start for you. Or, you could start off with the greatest game ever made, Xenoblade Definitive Edition. Whichever. So yeah, thanks for watching. Please join me in another 6 months from now when we'll finally talk about the game that Nintendo doesn't want you to remember, Xenoblade Chronicles X. But in all seriousness, guys, thank you so much for watching and supporting my content. It really does mean everything. My life has started to slow down a lot, so I'm hoping to pump out more review content in the future, including a review for Xenoblade X that I hope will be out much sooner than later. In any case, thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one.